Hi, everybody, and welcome to the first Something Comes Along podcast of 2026. Over the last year, we have, on this podcast, discussed many of the challenges that the world throws at people and how they navigate those challenges. On this podcast, we're going to be discussing the biggest challenge of all, bereavement and loss. My two guests today, Sarah David and Dr. Erin Thompson, have both experienced bereavement of a close family member or living with that loss, but also, as we're going to hear later, through an organisation called the Loss Foundation, or actively helping others in a similar situation. So Sarah, Erin, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Gary.
Nice to be here, thanks.
Obviously a heavy subject, but before we get on to that, we're quite keen to, I suppose, hear a little bit about you. You've both done so much, but if you can, if it's possible, I think I'll start with you, Sarah. I've known you the longest. Just bring yourself to life a little bit, career to date, who you are. That'll be lovely.
Thank you, and thanks for this opportunity to chat. So I started my life as a lawyer and then recovered very quickly from that, moving out of law into legal recruitment. I guess my formative job was I got this brilliant job at the age of 30 working for the global managing partner of Linklaters, and so many of my connections still from that space remain, including Gary. So that and various other executive roles, including being CEO of an autism school, work's really important to me. I really appreciate the work that I get to do with senior leaders and teams. And latterly, I'm a board chair of 3 organisations, including the Loss Foundation, with my dear colleague, Erin.
And thank you for mentioning me in your amazing career, the bit part I played, the walk-on part I played at one point. Thank you very much.
It's appreciated.
Erin.
Hi, Gary. So I am a clinical psychologist, and so I work across different kind of mental health sectors. And my main bulk of work is working as the director and founder of the Loss Foundation, national cancer bereavement charity. But I also work in the NHS and in the private sector. I guess mainly working with bereavement and grief, but also a range of other kind of mental health difficulties, anxiety, depression, and other things that come under the broad mental health umbrella. And so my week spans, I guess, doing the bulk of these things with most of my time on the Loss Foundation.
And Erin, how long have you known Sarah?
I have known Sarah. Sarah has been the chair of our board since September 2025, so under a year. But when I think of Sarah, the title of this podcast is, bang on, something comes along. And along came Sarah. And gosh, there's lots I could say about that, but let's put it under very, very good news.
Brilliant. And Erin, can I start with you? We're talking about loss and bereavement, and if you don't mind me asking, and obviously last week when we caught up, I trailed that I will be asking. What loss did you experience to lead you down the path you're in now?
So my dad died of cancer when I was 22. He got diagnosed when I was around age 20, and he was diagnosed with lung and spine cancer. And by the time he reached diagnosis, he was told it was sort of 12 out of 10 bad. It looked like he wouldn't be around much longer. And I was only 20, and I was kind of entering my career in mental health as a psychologist, but, just a young girl, and was very shocked and frightened. And then was a 2-year path of, a cancer journey or a cancer experience and all that came with, which was, really graphic, challenging moments and events, but lots of trying to be together and spend time together. And he passed in 2008, which in some ways seems forever ago and, like yesterday. But it was really the aftermath of his loss where it became so apparent that there just wasn't actually as much bereavement support available as one might think. And it was my stepmom who, about a year after he died, said, I really just want to speak to somebody else who's lost their soulmate. I've got a therapist and I've got family and friends, but I need to speak to somebody else who's struggling to get out of bed. because they've lost the person, they love so much. And at that point, I was a little further in my career in mental health and thought, well, then I'll find that thing. And I'll send you the information on that thing. And it just wasn't that thing. There are wonderful bereavement organizations in the UK doing a great job. But what became apparent were there were some wonderful organizations with specific focus on certain losses, suicide loss or baby loss, but this massive gap for cancer loss, which was just so bananas because the number of people that unfortunately die from cancer is really high. And so that was the very starting point of the Loss Foundation. And I never intended for it to be what it's become, but it's been beautifully organic in what it has become. And so in some ways, his death has been such a huge part of my career and my life, and that's conflicting and beautiful. But that was the starting point.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And some points I want to come back on naturally later. But Sarah, if you don't mind me asking the same question.
Of course. So I've lost 3 deeply loved people, and all of them sudden death. So a very different experience to the one Erin's had. So my darling husband, Jonathan, died in a car crash. He was 40. We'd been there about Denver, Colorado was where he died, and we'd been there about 19 months, having moved there from London. My very treasured mum, who died in a matter of hours on Mother's Day 2020, she and my brilliant dad, having continued to volunteer and go out in early March, because there wasn't a formal lockdown. And then my really darling eldest son, Robert, he died about 2.5 years ago. It's unclear whether he intended to take his own life, and he was just 23.
Well, so the time period between those 3 losses was what?
Was 11 years.
And going back to what Erin said, what did you find? What did you need? But what did you find out there by way of support and networks and help?
Yeah, great question. I do agree there is very little, and it's one of my big motivations for coming on this podcast. And it was a big motivation for joining Erin at the Loss Foundation, because my experience is pretty unusual in our environment, not in the world as a whole, actually, but in our environment, it's an unusual experience. And I don't believe it's the only certainty. The cliche is true. And yet we don't teach anything around it. We don't provide people with the tools and so on. As I said, I'm a huge reader. So when I went through this the first time with Jonathan, I was searching desperately for a great grief book. Again, my view, there aren't enough brilliant ones out there. Strong recommendation on The Other Side of Sadness by Greg Bonanno, who's anyone who's interested. So I did a lot of reading. I did connect with other widows. So I did a bit of social media and looking around. And I did find some sort of brave people out there. I was so touched, though, when some people got in touch with me who'd heard of me or heard of my experience and said, I too have walked this path. And they sent kindnesses. A neighbour of mine who I don't think I ever spoke to sent a beautiful letter. He sent me a 2-page letter about this had happened to him, and he'd heard what had happened to me. And I think that's one of the observations I'd love to make. Like, when something comes along, like, one of the gifts I've been given has been seeing the very best of people. Just the kindness and love that's been sent in my direction. Oh my gosh. The world is an incredible place. And I am very grateful for that. I say I've really seen the best of us and our kindness and love for one another.
And thank you, Sarah. You've led me to that very point. Is a bit just going back a step. So I'm lucky because I haven't experienced a loss like both of you have. So I'm very grateful I haven't, but it'll come to me. And so my questions are coming from a position of genuine interest stroke naivety in this area. So bear with me. But I was going to ask about, you know, friends, colleagues, neighbours, examples of things that people have done, have said that you remember really helping. And the second part is, I imagine that some people and a lot of people out there just don't know what to say, and sometimes therefore don't say or do anything. Is that true?
I'm thinking two things when you ask that, Gary. The first is, what do I remember being helpful to me? If I was being really frank, very little. I don't remember that. And I think what was going on was that so few people around me, although I have people who, very much loved and cared about my well-being, so few were willing to actually ask me or speak about it, much for the reasons, like you're mentioning there, don't know what to say. And so the obvious answer is to say nothing. Or, other barriers. I don't want to upset Erin, so probably best not to. Or this much time's passed, so maybe it's not, good to do. Or I don't know what to say, so I'll say nothing. Lots of barriers, I think, that come up because it's grief, and so I think that is true and that is fair. I know from, being part of the Loss Foundation and having listened to thousands of people's examples of what has been helpful is some sense of acknowledgement. You've lost someone you love so much, and when that's not acknowledged, it's actually quite painful and disconnecting. And grief is so incredibly isolating very quickly. Maybe a rush of support around a funeral time, and quickly that falls off a cliff. And then, as a bereaved person, you're quite alone with your experience. And so acknowledgement, but, talking, connecting in any way to grief, I think is really helpful. And I think it is fair to say that people don't know how all of the time, unless maybe they've been through it. But that is where we can come in and help with that. And I don't know, Sarah, if you have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, saying our loved ones' names, that's the thing that so there's a great tactic, which is if somebody tells you of a loss and they don't mention the name, a beautiful question, what was their name? It's such a generous question to us, because people aren't mentioning our loved ones' names because they're not here living on the earth anymore. So there's perhaps no reason not to. But that's such a generous question. What was their name? And tell me about them.
What they like, yeah.
Tell me about them. And then being okay if the person wells up. Because, our tears, they're part of our love. They're part of our emotions. They're part of our way of being. And then to then be like, oh no, I'm sorry to have upset you, or I shouldn't have mentioned them. Like our loved dead ones aren't on our minds like all the freaking time, guys. Oh, do you know, I'd totally forgotten, completely forgotten about them. And then you mention their name, and now,
Yeah.
But it's almost like gratitude. Like you've given me the gift to be able to tell you about Rob, or tell you about Jonathan, or tell you about Mum. Like that's such a gift. So I do think that's one of the easiest things. And if you can be okay with a bit of emotion, please, so generous.
How do you address that through the foundation? I guess in a number of different ways. We offer cancer-specific support, so that we run a few different types of events. I guess our main one is our support groups, where we create a space where it is okay to even talk about these things and to not be worried about upsetting people or fear of judgment. And so just being advocates of that space and being able to speak about those things. And I guess, we're all about connection to others. So everything we do is group based. So we don't provide any one-to-one counselling, and not because that's not useful, but that's what lots of other places do. And actually one of our USPs is bringing people together in loss and helping tackle isolation. So we run support events in lots of different ways, but we also run some workshops, which, they're led by our clinical psychologists in the team, and they're very much sort of partial support group, but also passing on kind of information about how to look after yourselves, or how to manage some of those really difficult things that come up in grief, like I can't sleep, or I can't get that memory out of my head, or I can't shift that guilt I'm feeling, And so we try and empower people with some information that helps them kind of look after themselves, and also think about how to look after themselves in this social world where grief's actually really hard to navigate socially. And so sometimes that includes giving them tips on how to help them get the help they need, even within their own family unit. And actually, what we often see most of the time is our users are empowering others to do this with all of their own tips and all of their own experiences. And so that magical bit of sort of the power of just connecting and talking out loud, a lot of them are sort of helping each other in that process. So feeling supported, and maybe like they've supported someone else. And all the research shows us that's an incredibly powerful experience for well-being. So yeah, just a whistle-stop tour of what we do.
A couple of questions I had, which are definitely in the category of naive questions. The stages of grief. You Google said, is that a thing? Do you recognise that?
So I was very familiar with this 5 stages because I'd done a huge amount of change management in my career.
Yep.
The thing I didn't realise until Jonathan died was that research was done with the people who were dying.
Okay.
Okay.
Right.
And that, I think, is a really, really important fact
Yes, it is.
for people to understand. Because one of the first thoughts I had was, I don't want to be angry at Jonathan. That was one of the I can remember having just been told and going in the car on the way to have to tell my beautiful boys. And I remember that being a really vivid thing. I don't want to be furious at him, Erin, please.
Yeah. I mean, gosh. Yeah. I mean, Sarah has sort of started with the main bit, we recognize that if people have heard of any model, it's going to be this one. As Sarah said, this was designed as a model of the emotions people go through in palliative care, end of life, developed by an incredible, grief writer and author, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. But this isn't an evidence-based model for what people actually experience in grief. And so the model gets a fair bit of criticism, but it's still the most well-known model that gets banded around. And I think there's a media aspect to that. 5 neat emotions, easy to summarize, easy to shove in an infographic. But actually, there are many, many models, a couple of which definitely are favorites within the Loss Foundation that are a much more individualized experience of what grief can actually look like, and include some of the complexity that come with it. And so part of our work is sort of empowering people with that information, and helping them sort of have an idea of different ways of visualizing grief that respects their own experience, rather than how can we shove you into this category. And grief is broad. It is incredibly broad. And sadness is the first thing people will think about when you say grief. Of course, that is a benchmark of grief, but holy moly, that there are so many more experiences and emotions that come with it.
And I'm gonna double my cliche count now by going to time is a healer. And I assume that's kind of true, but time goes on a long time, doesn't it?
So I love the visual. My favorite visual that really works for me on this shows these different jars, 3 different jars, and shows this big ball of black. And in the first jar, the ball and the black are almost one and the same thing. And in the second one, the jar's a bit bigger, the ball of black's still there. And in the third one, the ball of black's still there, and the jar's a bit, bigger still. So, my experience is life just becomes different. And if you're guided and fortunate and all sorts of other words, then you find a way to sort of model your grief and your experience into how you live, that Japanese thing, kintsugi, have you ever heard of that? They have this beautiful thing where if a bowl is broken, a precious bowl is broken, they mend it with gold. And so it's this beautiful thing of how, we're all a bit broken, and, those cracks and those things in us there, it's still a beautiful thing. It's still okay, but it's different to what it was. I'm nothing like in so many ways the person I was 12 years ago. I am wildly, wildly, wildly different. And I talk to people about the fact I'm utterly broken and smashed, and I'm the strongest person you know. And both of these things are true.
Yeah. And I'm nodding because you told me the bowl thing before, and I love it, and I'm nodding again. The time as a healer, puts up, well, I'm thinking two things. I must always think two things. But, and I sometimes say this with patients, if I was to generalize, and I really try not to do that because everybody's so unique, but if I was to generalize what I have observed in, providing therapy for loss or in the Loss Foundation over time, is that over time, grief becomes less raw, and people find a way to engage with life and function and navigate a life where grief is part of it. So in some ways, that feels like time as a healer. But, that phrase also puts us at risk of falling into the platitude kind of category, because it all depends on the delivery. If someone's struggling and I say, time's a healer, there's a subtext there, which is, so, you shouldn't be so sad, because it's, you're going to get better. It's the same, potentially, depending on delivery, as there are other fish in the sea. They wouldn't want you to be unhappy, and all of these things have a sort of silent second half of the sentence that the grieving person hears, which is, oh, so I shouldn't feel this way. And so there's risk of that phrase depending on the delivery. I don't inherently disagree with it, but I think there are more useful phrases and visuals. Grief is something that changes shape over time. And, what we're trying to help people do is make room for it, and then help them engage in a life that feels like worth living whilst they stay connected to their loved one in a meaningful way as they move forward. So that will happen over time, and maybe time it gets easier. But I think lots of things play a role, not just time.
And as time goes by, there'll be micro ups and downs within the macro picture. And Sarah, you said to me when we had the pre-call on this last week, something I wrote down, ask people how you are today, as opposed to how are you. Like saying, are you okay? People say, yes, I'm okay, and then doesn't go any further. And that's because I assume that Tuesday will be different to Wednesday.
Absolutely. And I think particularly that question in the very early stages is utterly overwhelming. I had Jonathan's best friend, Calvin, he was one of those incredible people. He called me every day. He called me every single day for, I think it was 5 months. And he basically said to me the day after Jonathan died, he said some version of, I'm going to call you every day, and I'm going to call you every day until you tell me to stop. And the reason it was an incredible gift is I didn't even want to speak to me some days. And he must have dreaded making those calls on many days, but he did it. And that was, what a gift, what a commitment. But he's a scriptwriter. He lives in LA. He's a scriptwriter. he made me, I had this brilliant sort of clique of incredible friends. And in our group, this was before the WhatsApp, but he made me this badge. Can I swear on this or not?
Well, it kind of depends on the word, but I'm going to go yes, you can.
Okay. And he made me this badge that said, how the fuck do you think I am?
That's great.
Yeah. Brilliant.
And he also made me a business card that said widow on the front side. And on the back side said some version of, dear, this is when we're still in the States, dear teller, server, administrator, this is my dear friend who's just been widowed, and you just need to give her whatever the hell it is that, she's asking for. Because, one of the hardest things about the grief is the sadmin that goes with it. And, a PSA, if you are living in the UK, make a will. make a will. Don't wait till you've got everything that you need together to make the will. Just make the will. Because without it, it becomes, that administration. It's unbelievable what bereaved people have to go through on the administration side.
Amazing. Thank you. Just echoing something one of you guys said before, and I heard this personally from a widow or someone who lost their life, that at the time of the death and the funeral, there's a wave, a tidal wave of lovely letters and calls and everyone how they were the closest thing to them in their lives, and then a complete drop off, a total drop off about a week or two later, like they've been forgotten. And it's why I always, for that particular person, I try and remember every couple of months to say something. Maybe I should do it every day, but the point is that when other people aren't, stepping up can be very powerful.
I was just going to say, I've never heard an example as amazing as that one. Being called every day is such a commitment to the I won't go quiet on you. Honestly, that is incredible. To have the foresight that would be a helpful thing to do, to own any difficult feelings that he may carry in hearing distress. Like, that is amazing. It is amazing. And I love the card, and maybe we should sell it as merchandise.
Well, indeed.
Or give it away.
One of the things I've as well is when you're connecting to people, how powerful it is to be able to speak to people who've been through what you're going through. How important that is. Amongst the people who may say hello and getting in touch, being able to actually speak to people who are 1 month ahead of the journey or 6 months ahead of the journey must be so powerful.
Do you know what? That makes me think of our events, and while you're talking about it, I'm thinking of one of the things we do, which is, run retreats. Now, a bereavement retreat doesn't sound that fun, on the tin. And, we've run these across a number of years. And the aim there was, we're running these support groups, but they're kind of only so long. And people were, making it clear that they wanted to connect over longer periods. And we wanted to give them room to, because more time means more depth potentially and better strength of connection. But also we had so much we wanted to model to them as, listen, this is how we recommend kind of holding in mind about looking after yourself, which is room for connection, eating 3 nutritious meals a day, time outside. We can teach you some stuff that we know about grief, like these models that might help, some mindfulness or meditation. And we have this incredible weekend design. But without fail, every single time people turn up to this retreat, what a courageous thing to do, full of nerves. I mean, you can see them shaking with nerves when they arrive, because what a vulnerable position to put yourself in. But they're doing it because they desperately want to connect to others who've been through this and make room for their grief. And within 48 hours, we see people having arrived from shaking to leaving, laughing, hugging, new friendships, depth of connection within 2 days. And that's not because we're doing anything that's rocket science. It's because they have connected to people who have made room for their loss, been through similar situations. They've had an opportunity to speak about it without judgment, without fear, without all the barriers we've mentioned thus far. And I think that the power of being supported by someone else who gets it is amazing. I firmly believe that you don't have to have been through it to be supportive, but I recognize that being through it, gives a different level of getting.
I really do agree with that, Erin, as well. Like some of my friends, like Calvin, he'd never been through anything like that. And yet, so that is an encouragement I would give to people. Like, don't think that because you haven't been through it, you can't. And also, some people who have been through it are also not that helpful, to be candid.
Yes. Yes.
I had a terrible widow who said a thing that was just awful, so just because you've been through it. But do something. Write a card, save a name, make a meal, bring it over, drop it on the doorstep. Just do something. It means so much to us. We never forget you. We never, ever will forget you.
And in fact, I was thinking that exact phrase this morning, because I had a separate meeting, a little bit speaking about, what we're learning about, people going through bereavement. And then it came to me like, be the person they never forget. Like Calvin. Like, be Calvin. Be the person they never forget, because Sarah's right. When someone has gone above and beyond, and it might be someone you never speak to, or someone who's close, but you will literally never forget it. So, the aim here is to be the person they never forget. However, to make it one step easier, I really recognize as soon as you add the grief word, it paralyzes people because it's grief. Oh, I don't know what to do. Whereas if we took that grief word away, and actually I was faced with a friend who's going through a really hard time, that doesn't feel as much of a barrier. If they're going through a hard time, I'd probably say, hey, how's it been? How you been feeling? How are you coping? What's been happening? Fill me in. As soon as it's grief, it's like, oh, no, I don't know what to say. Whereas I'm going to argue it's the same skills. It's exactly the same skills. We maybe need to sort of be mindful of labeling it as this, grief thing that means I'm required to do something different, because I'm not sure you are.
Thank you. I've got two more questions to ask you before we kind of draw us to a close. One is about can you prepare for loss? So if someone is a loved one's going to pass away soon for whatever reason that might be, is it even possible to prepare, or does it affect people so differently?
So there is a thing called anticipatory grief, where in the knowledge that somebody is going to die or death is imminent, this most commonly falls in when people have had a prolonged illness, that people may well be experiencing what we would call anticipatory grief, where I start to notice loss or changes already. They've started to lose abilities, or, the relationship dynamic has changed because of dependence, and so already there are losses before the big loss, right? And so people do have experiences of that. However, that's very different from sort of the grief that comes with a bereavement. And lots of things play a role there. Sometimes having an opportunity to say all the things you want to have said can be very helpful for the grief that you process afterwards. But those conversations are hard to have, and, don't always have the opportunity to do so. They're slightly different griefs. What I would say we sort of often hear is that when someone dies, if it is, anything like cancer or a deterioration or an illness, it's often only at that point that you process the grief and everything that happened before. Because if they've been unwell or you've been going through things with them, you're in survival mode. And so often people do get hit with quite a lot when the person dies. That doesn't mean you can't prepare in ways or grieve before, but they're quite different sort of psychological experiences.
Anything to add, Sarah?
I've never had that situation. So I think knowing that in all of the situations, I think there's this thing like, I suppose it's a bigger life thing. Like, regardless of whether grief or loss is in play, say the things that you want to say to the people that you love and care about. Because in all my cases, I was like, there isn't anything that if I'd have had the opportunity, there's nothing I would have said.
Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting, because what I was just going to add is I had the opportunity to say something to my dad, and I didn't. And I remember the day. So we knew that death was in the following days, and he was in hospital. And I remember it was just me and him, and he was in the hospital bed and I was to the side, and I'd suggested playing cards and he didn't want to. And then there was sort of quite a long silence. And I remember thinking, oh, now is probably the time. And I just couldn't. I really wanted to, but it was too much. And I think it would have been too much for him, and it would have been too much for me. And I say that because just because you have the opportunity doesn't mean you do. However, I say it to my husband and my boys all the time, because I can do that. And I couldn't in that moment, but I can now. And I'm with Sarah. There is no greater perspective than loss. And because I'm faced with it so much in my working life, I'm reminded all the time of how quickly life can change. And so I try so hard, and sometimes the grasp is looser, but like Sarah's saying, say what you got to say. And like I said to Sarah, I love quite hard, I love quite loud, and like to be quite vocal about my feelings. It comes with the psychologist territory, but I think also my personality.
One final question I've got is, if someone is listening to this and they have just experienced a loss, what's the one piece of advice that you'd give them?
I think the pressure is in the one,
Yeah.
because there's a million things flying through my mind. And if I was just to pluck one though that's sort of returning to me, is that you don't have to do it alone. Be it the Loss Foundation or another organization. I think because it's such a human thing we all go through, there's an assumption that we just get on with it. It's quite a British thing as well, but you don't have to do it alone, would be my kind of bit of advice, and that there are things exist that are there to support you along the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think my one piece of advice, if I were to boil it down to one, would be do your very best to love yourself the best you can, to wrap your arms around yourself, to be kind to yourself. It's a really tough thing. It's a really tough thing, and particularly if you don't have people around you who know it or understand it, it's a heartbreakingly lonely path. So I would really agree with Erin's, like, you definitely don't have to do this on your own. If you're watching this, reach out to me, just reach out to somebody. It's like your core message, Gary, right? We're not alone. There are people out there, and I know it can feel so lonely, but you are not alone.
Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. It's a not an easy thing to do. So thank you. And also thank you for the work that you both do and the help you give to people. And that just leaves me to thank you all for listening to this episode of the Something Comes Along podcast, which is a Totem Partners production. We'll see you next time.